Alien Girl was seconds away from becoming Alien BQ. Then a human hero appeared, Sci-Fi story The Blazing Sun of Zarek, 12 burned hot, and unyielding as it beat down on the barren wasteland. The sand, a deep golden hue, stretched out for miles, nothing but the harsh wind and the stifling heat for company. Captain Zachary Axton, an experienced in battle, hardened soldier, wiped the sweat from his brow, his muscular frame barely able to shield itself from the relentless assault of the twin suns. His deep green eyes narrowed as the distant outline of the alien settlement came into view. The settlement, nestled between jagged cliffs, was nothing more than a cluster of crude stone huts and rusted metal structures that looked as though they'd been abandoned centuries ago. Stupid mission, Zach muttered to himself, adjusting the pulse rifle slung over his shoulder. His short black hair clung to his forehead, and the thick leather armor that covered his body seemed to weigh more by the second. What did I agree to this? A soft voice, mechanical and devoid of emotion, responded through his earpiece. Captain Axton, the transaction will be profitable. The Zurichian minerals will yield high value on the market. Your payout is expected to exceed 30 million credits. Zach grunted, ignoring the AI's response as he trudged through the thick sand, his boots leaving deep impressions in the soft earth. His mission was supposed to be straightforward. Meet with the Zurichian traders, secure the mineral deposit, and leave the planet. But nothing ever went as planned when it came to alien encounters, especially not when a large sum of credits was on the line. As he approached the settlement, Zach could feel the temperature rising, the heat causing the air to shimmer in the distance. The Zurichian people were a strange and intimidating race. Tall, muscular, and covered in thick, reptilian scales that ranged from dark green to black. Their eyes glowed an eerie yellow, and their sharp teeth glistened in the sunlight. They didn't trust humans, and with good reason. The two species had been in a cold war for years, with no clear victor in sight. Zach's mind shifted back to his mission. He had been hired by the Federation to broker a trade deal with the Zurichians, arms in exchange for their mineral resources. The Federation had promised him a lucrative payout if he succeeded, but there was always a risk when dealing with alien races, especially a race as volatile and prideful as the Zurichians. He reached the settlement's entrance, where a Zurichian warrior stood guard. The massive creature, easily twice Zach's size, glared down at him with predatory eyes, its sharp claws twitching in anticipation. Zach, unflinching, met the warrior's gaze and nodded. "I'm here to see your leader," Zach said coolly, his voice carrying over the sound of the wind. The Zurichian warrior grunted, stepping aside and allowing Zach to pass. As he made his way deeper into the settlement, he could feel the eyes of the Zurichian inhabitants upon him, watching, waiting, calculating. Finally, he reached the center of the settlement, where the Zurichian chieftain awaited him. The chieftain was a massive figure, towering over Zach by nearly 3 feet. His skin was a deep black, with streaks of green running across his back, his sharp eyes glinting with suspicion. Around his neck hung a collection of bone and metal ornaments, symbols of his power and status within the Zurichian tribe. "You bring weapons, human," the chieftain growled in broken galactic standard, his voice low and threatening. Zach nodded, reaching into his pack and pulling out the case of pulse rifles. Top of the line tech, just as promised. The chieftain's eyes scanned the weapons, his nostrils flaring. After a long moment, he gave a satisfied nod, signaling the trade had begun. But then, as if out of nowhere, a piercing scream cut through the air, a scream so sharp it made the hairs on Zach's neck stand up. Without thinking, Zach's hand flew to his pulse rifle, his eyes scanning the settlement for the source of the scream. It came from the large fire pit at the far end of the settlement. His gaze zeroed in on the figure hanging above the flames, an alien woman, her crimson skin glowing in the firelight. She was bound by thick ropes, her body suspended above the fire, her eyes wide with terror. Zach's breath caught in his throat. She was beautiful, an otherworldly beauty with vibrant violet eyes that seemed to search the crowd for help. She was a Parthian, a race known for their strength and resilience. Zach had only heard rumors of them, rumors of their fierce will and warrior spirit, but nothing had prepared him for the sight before him. "Stop," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. His hand clenched around the pulse rifle as he took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The chieftain turned to him, his face twisted in a cruel grin. Human, you see our tradition. Parthian flesh is a delicacy, very tender. A special occasion. Zack's anger flared. Not today. He didn't fully understand what was compelling him to act, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let this woman die. Without thinking, he strode forward, his gaze locked on the chieftain. How much for her? Zack demanded, his voice hard and unwavering. The chieftain blinked, surprised by the sudden shift in Zack's attitude. She is not for trade, he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. She is the feast. Zack's jaw tightened. All of them, the weapons, all of them in exchange for her. The chieftain laughed, a deep, gravelly sound that reverberated in the air. One meal for all of your weapons. Are you out of your mind? Zack didn't flinch. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him, but he didn't care. This was bigger than the mission, bigger than the credits. The woman's eyes were locked onto him, filled with a mix of fear and desperate hope. I'm not leaving without her, Zack said firmly, his voice low and commanding. The chieftain studied him for a long moment, his reptilian eyes narrowing. Then, with a harsh bark of orders, he signaled two of his warriors to untie the Parthian woman. Zack stood still, his pulse racing as he watched the ropes that bound her fall away. When she was finally free, she collapsed to the ground, her body trembling but her eyes never leaving his. He took a step forward and reached out a hand, his fingers brushing her arm gently. You're safe now, he said quietly. I'll get you out of here. The woman's violet eyes met his, and for the first time since her capture, a flicker of hope appeared in them. Thank you, she whispered, her voice hoarse from the screams and smoke. My name is Lyra. I'm Zack, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. Let's get you out of here. But as they turned to leave, the chieftain's voice boomed. You've made a grave mistake. Human, we will hunt you. Zack turned back to face the chieftain, his hand still on Lyra's arm. Then I'll be ready, he said, his tone unwavering. But you're not getting her back. As they walked away from the settlement, the weight of their decision settled in. Zack's mind raced, but there was no turning back now. Lyra was with him, and he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. They had a long journey ahead of them, and it wouldn't be easy. But Zack couldn't help but feel a spark of something deeper than just duty. And as the Zerakian desert stretched out before them, he knew that their adventure was only just beginning. The harsh winds of the Zerakian desert blew fiercely as Zack and Lyra made their way through the scorching landscape. The sun hung high in the sky, casting an oppressive heat over the barren dunes. They walked in silence, the weight of their situation settling heavily on their shoulders. The settlement was now a distant memory, and their journey to the extraction point seemed endless. The pulse rifle slung across Zack's back seemed to grow heavier with each step, and his mind raced, calculating their next move, the ever-present danger of the Zerakians close behind them. Zack glanced over at Lyra. She walked with an effortless grace despite the ordeal she had just been through. Her crimson skin shimmered under the burning sun, and her silver hair, though matted and tangled, still held an ethereal beauty. The fire crystal pendant she wore around her neck caught the light, a symbol of her people, and something Zack knew he'd need to learn more about. You all right? Zack asked, his voice soft but carrying over the desert wind. Lyra didn't look at him at first but nodded slowly, her violet eyes scanning the horizon. I will be, she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her tone. It's not the first time I've been in a tight spot. Zack raised an eyebrow. You've been tied to a fire pit before. She met his gaze with a faint, knowing smile. Not exactly, but I've had my fair share of close calls. They continued walking in silence for a while. The only sound the crunch of their boots in the sand and the distant call of Zerakian wildlife. Zack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He didn't know if it was the paranoia of the moment or if his instincts were truly picking up something. He had spent enough time in hostile environments to know when something was off. How far are we from your ship? Lyra asked, breaking the silence, her voice a bit rough from her earlier ordeal. Zack glanced at her, noting the subtle tension in her posture. A few miles, he answered, his voice low. But with the terrain and those Zerakian bastards hunting us, it'll take longer than usual. We'll need to stay off the main trails. They'll be looking for tracks. Lyra nodded, her expression serious. I can move off the beaten path. My people know how to traverse deserts like these. Zack studied her for a moment, a hint of suspicion creeping into his mind. Your people. So you're not just a diplomat, huh? Lyra shot him a sidelong glance. I never said I was. But that's not something you need to worry about. Zack's lips quirked into a half smile. I think I've got enough to worry about already. His smile faded as he looked around at the desolate landscape. I don't suppose you have any idea why the Xerekians wanted you as dinner instead of a trade partner. Lyra's expression hardened at the mention of the Xerakian tribe. The Xerekians are a proud and brutal race. They value strength above all else. Weakness is a death sentence to them. And they often take prisoners from other species to cook as a symbol of dominance. I never expected them to capture me, especially not like that. Zack nodded thoughtfully, his eyes scanning the horizon. That crystal you're wearing. The Xerekians seemed really interested in it. What is it? Lyra's fingers brushed the pendant at her throat, her eyes distant for a moment. This crystal holds the key to our survival. It's a fire crystal, a rare and powerful relic from my people. It contains military intelligence, information about our defenses, strategic weaknesses, and even the Krell fleet's movements. I'm on a mission to deliver it to our military outpost on Helios Prime. Zack's mind whirred at the mention of the Krell. The name was infamous in certain circles, a race of conquerors known for their ruthless expansion across the galaxy. The Krell, Zack asked, his voice tight. They've been targeting your people. Lyra nodded, her expression darkening. They're a constant threat. They've been expanding for years, wiping out entire systems, enslaving populations. They've set their sights on my people, the Parthians, and they won't stop until they've crushed us completely. Zack's brow furrowed. And you're carrying all this intel alone. Just one person. Lyra gave him a small, rueful smile. I'm not alone anymore. Zack glanced at her, their eyes meeting for a moment. There was something in her gaze, a deep, unspoken understanding. She had her own reasons for being here, reasons that went far beyond diplomacy or intel. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance. There was a fire inside her, a will to fight, to survive, to protect her people. And somehow, despite everything, Zack found himself drawn to that fire. Before he could say anything else, a sudden noise broke the silence. The distant sound of engines. Zack's heart skipped a beat as he froze, his instincts kicking in. Xerekians. He muttered under his breath. Lyra's eyes narrowed, her hand moving to her waist where a small metallic device rested. They're close. We need to find cover, now. Without another word, Zack grabbed her arm, pulling her toward a cluster of large rocks a few hundred yards away. They crouched behind the boulders, their breath heavy in the hot air. Zack's hand instinctively went to his rifle, his pulse quickening as the sound of engines grew louder. They were being hunted, and the Xerekians weren't going to stop until they caught them. Lyra turned to him, her voice low but urgent. We need to split up. If we stick together, they'll catch us both. I'll draw their attention. Zack shook his head. No way. I'm not leaving you. Her violet eyes met his, a flicker of emotion flashing through them before she hardened again. You don't have a choice. If we're going to survive this, we need to play it smart. Trust me. Zack hesitated for a moment, then nodded. All right, but don't do anything stupid. Lyra gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. I won't. You just stay alive, Captain. Before he could respond, she slipped away into the shadows, her movements as fluid and silent as a ghost. Zack watched her disappear, a mix of admiration and anxiety gnawing at him. He had no idea what kind of person she really was. But one thing was clear, she was dangerous, and now she was on his side. The sound of the Xerekian engines grew louder, and Zack steeled himself for what was about to come. He had a sinking feeling that things were about to get much worse before they got better. Zack crouched low behind the boulder, his heart thudding in his chest. The Xerekian engines had grown louder, their ominous hum drawing closer with every passing second. His fingers gripped the pulse rifle tightly, his knuckles white from the pressure. The desert around him was eerily silent now, save for the sound of his breath and the faint rustle of sand shifting underfoot. He had no idea where Lyra had gone, or what she was doing to draw the Xerekians away from him, but he trusted her. At least, he hoped he did. A cloud of dust erupted in the distance, and Zack's eyes narrowed as he saw the first of the Zarikian pursuit vehicles break over the horizon. There were 3 of them, their hover bikes kicking up thick clouds of sand as they swerved and careened across the terrain. They were fast, much faster than the average human vehicle, and their riders were even faster. Each of the Zarikians perched atop the bikes was a hulking creature, their reptilian features twisted into menacing snarls. The chieftain's warriors, no doubt, hunting for the woman who had eluded them so easily. Zack's grip tightened around his rifle. The warriors were looking for him. And Lyra, he had to keep his head down. They had to pass by him before he could make his move. He had no idea how long Lyra had. But he could only hope she was doing her part in keeping the Zarikians distracted. If they caught her before he could draw them away, if they found her, they wouldn't hesitate to tear her apart. Zack couldn't let that happen. Not again. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. The first Zarikian rider came into view, his enormous frame hunched over the handlebars of his hover bike. His dark green scales glistened in the harsh sunlight, and his yellow eyes were fixed ahead, scanning the horizon. Zack's heart skipped a beat as the warrior drew closer. Just as the Zarikian neared, Zack sprang into action. He leaped from behind the boulder, his pulse rifle aimed directly at the bike's engine. The shot rang out, the pulse blast hitting the rear of the bike with a force that sent the rider tumbling to the sand, his machine skidding out of control before it exploded in a fiery ball of flames. The other 2 riders veered off, surprised by the sudden attack, but it didn't take long for them to regain their composure. They charged toward Zack, their claws gleaming in the sunlight, their rage palpable. Zack didn't hesitate. He moved swiftly, using the terrain to his advantage, darting behind rocks and sand dunes as the 2 remaining Zarikians gave chase. His pulse rifle fired again, hitting one of the riders square in the chest. The rider's body jerked backward as the blast hit, sending him flying off the bike. The second warrior, furious now, turned his weapon on Zack, his eyes flashing with hatred. "You think you can stop me, human?" The Zarikian growled, his voice gravelly. Zack gritted his teeth and dropped behind a large boulder, narrowly avoiding the incoming fire. The Zarikian's shots hit the rock, causing sparks to fly, but Zack didn't waste time. He circled around, moving in a wide arc, trying to find an angle that would give him the upper hand. The Zarikian turned his bike, following Zack's movements with his deadly weapon, but Zack was quicker. In one smooth motion, Zack vaulted over a dune, landing directly behind the Zarikian. His combat knife flashed out in a blur of motion, slicing through the air before embedding itself in the warrior's exposed neck. The Zarikian let out a strangled cry, his yellow eyes wide in shock as his body went limp, tumbling from the bike as it skidded to a halt in the sand. Zack exhaled sharply, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his fingers trembling slightly as he picked up his rifle and scanned the area for any remaining threats. The second Zarikian had been eliminated, and the first one was already out of the fight, but there was no time to relax. There was still one more to deal with. He moved quickly, sweeping his rifle over his shoulder and scanning the horizon once more. His eyes darted around, searching for any signs of Lyra's movements. He had to find her. They couldn't waste any more time. As he moved through the sand, a faint sound reached his ears, a soft, rhythmic clicking. It was coming from behind him. Zack turned just in time to see a shadow fall across the dune he had just passed. The last Zarikian, much larger than the others, was approaching, his massive frame silhouetted against the sun. His eyes were locked on Zack, filled with pure, unrelenting fury. Zack cursed under his breath. There was no time for a long fight. He had to end it quickly. He ducked behind another boulder, his pulse rifle in hand, and waited. The Zarikian's shadow grew closer, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Zack held his breath, waiting for the right moment. When the Zarikian came into range, Zack fired. The blast struck the warrior in the side, knocking him off balance. The Zarikian let out a roar of pain and swung his massive weapon, an energy axe, at the boulder where Zack had been hiding. Zack barely had time to dodge as the axe came crashing down, its energy field sizzling through the air, vaporizing the rock where he'd just been standing. He took a step back, then dove forward, rolling toward the Zarikian's exposed flank. In one swift motion, he brought his knife up, slashing at the warrior's vulnerable side. The Zarikian howled in pain, stumbling backward as his weapon fell from his grasp. Zack didn't hesitate. He grabbed the Zarikian by the arm and twisted, using the warrior's own momentum against him. With a sharp crack, the Zarikian's arm broke, and Zack took advantage of the opening, driving the knife deep into the warrior's chest. The Zarikian's eyes widened in surprise, and with a final, guttural growl, he collapsed to the ground. Zack stood over him, panting heavily as he wiped the blood from his blade. His heart was still racing, but the battle was over. At least, for now. He looked around quickly, making sure there were no more Zarikians waiting to ambush him. The desert was still. Too still. A chill ran down his spine. "Lara!" He called out, his voice carrying over the wind. There was no answer. Just the distant sound of sand shifting in the breeze. "Lara!" Zack called again, louder this time, his voice filled with urgency. Still no response. Zack's pulse quickened as he scanned the area, his eyes searching for any sign of movement. Had she been caught? Had something happened to her while he was fighting? Panic surged through him, but he pushed it down. He couldn't afford to lose his cool. Not now. A flicker of movement caught his eye. In the distance, just beyond the edge of a rocky outcropping, he saw a shadow Lara. She was running, her crimson skin glinting in the sunlight, her silver hair flowing behind her like a banner. She was alive. "Lara!" Zack shouted, relief flooding through him. She glanced back, her violet eyes meeting his. There was a fleeting look of gratitude on her face, but her expression quickly turned serious again as she motioned for him to follow. Zack didn't need any more encouragement. He sprinted toward her, his feet pounding the sand as they closed the distance. He could hear the faint sound of Zarikian engines revving in the distance. More reinforcements. But this time, they wouldn't catch them. Zack pushed his legs harder, the sand flying beneath him as he raced toward Lara. His heart was pounding in his chest, adrenaline surging through his veins. The Zarikians were relentless, and the sounds of their engines getting closer only spurred him on. He wasn't about to lose her, not after everything they had been through. His hand never left the pulse rifle slung across his back, but for the moment, he focused on getting to her, keeping her safe. Lara reached the rocky outcrop ahead of him, her silver hair streaming behind her like a comet's tail. Her movements were precise, calculated. She had an air of determination that he had come to admire in such a short time. She glanced over her shoulder, giving him a brief, acknowledging nod before ducking behind a large boulder. Zack reached her in seconds, his breath coming in heavy bursts. He crouched beside her, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the Zarikians. "Not much further," Lara said, her voice steady but urgent. "My ship is just beyond that ridge. We can make it if we keep moving." Zack looked at her, his gaze lingering on the fire crystal pendant that hung around her neck. It seemed to glow with an inner fire, a reminder of what they were running for, what they had to protect. "How far?" he asked, not wanting to waste time on unnecessary conversation. "Maybe half a mile," she replied. "But we're not exactly walking in a straight line, are we?" Zack smirked, the humor lost in the gravity of the situation. "No, I guess not." The sound of engines revving echoed through the air again, closer now, much closer. They didn't have much time. "Move!" Lara barked, pushing off the rock with a sudden burst of energy. Zack followed, his boots crunching on the sand as they made their way toward the ridge. The wind had picked up, swirling the sand around them in a choking cloud. It wasn't easy to see, but they had no choice but to keep moving forward. As they climbed the ridge, Zack could feel the presence of the Zarikian pursuit closing in. He scanned the terrain behind them, his senses heightened, but all he could see were the shifting sands. He was becoming too aware of the ticking clock. The Zarikians were fast, and they would never stop until they had caught them. Lara's hand shot out, grabbing his arm to steady him as they reached the top of the ridge. She was scanning the horizon, her sharp eyes catching something that Zack couldn't see. Her jaw clenched. "We've got company," she muttered under her breath. Zack quickly followed her gaze. In the distance, the telltale sign of approaching vehicles was unmistakable. 3 Zarikian hover bikes, just cresting the hill behind them. They were getting closer. "Jet down," Zack hissed, pulling Lara low to the ground as the sandstorm began to thicken around them. It was the perfect cover, but it wouldn't last long. The Zarikians would have sensors capable of cutting through the dust. They wouldn't be fooled for long. Lyra motioned toward a narrow crevice in the rocks, barely wide enough for a human body to squeeze through. It was their best chance for cover, and they had to take it. Without a word, she darted toward it, her movements a blur of fluid grace. Zack followed close behind, his pulse racing as they slipped into the narrow opening, their bodies pressed tight against the jagged rock. The storm raged outside, the wind howling like some furious beast, but inside the crevice, the world was still. For a moment, there was only silence, broken only by their ragged breaths. Zack leaned against the rock, the cool stone offering him a brief respite from the heat of the desert. He wiped his face, realizing just how much sweat had accumulated on his brow. His hands were still trembling from the fight with the Xerikians. He glanced over at Lyra. She was crouched down beside him, her violet eyes sharp and calculating, as though she was already formulating their next move. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Lyra nodded once, but there was an underlying tension in her posture. "I've been in worse situations," she replied, though Zack could see the flicker of exhaustion in her eyes. She was holding it together, but for how long? Zack's own exhaustion was catching up with him. The journey through the desert, the firefight, and the constant pressure of their dwindling time. It was starting to take its toll. He had been in a lot of close calls before, but this felt different. They weren't just fighting for survival now, they were fighting for something much larger. Something that could change the course of the war. "Listen," Zack said after a pause. "You never told me exactly what's in that crystal. You just said it was military intel. But what exactly are we looking at here? Why is it so important to your people?" Lyra took a deep breath, her eyes focused ahead as she considered his question. For a moment, she didn't answer, but Zack waited patiently. He had learned not to rush people when it came to things like this. They would speak when they were ready. "It's not just any intel," Lyra said finally, her voice low, carrying the weight of everything she had been through. "The fire crystal holds information on the Krell fleet. Locations of their warships, their weak points, even their attack patterns. It's encoded in a way that can only be read by specialized equipment. But once we decode it, we'll have everything we need to launch a counterattack." Zack processed the information, his mind racing. "So, this crystal could be the key to defeating the Krell. This is bigger than we thought." Lyra nodded. "Exactly. If we can get this to our military outpost on Helios Prime, we can tip the balance in the war. The Krell have been winning for too long, and we need allies to fight back. This crystal could be the difference between life and death for my people." Zack's gaze softened as he looked at her, his mind spinning with the enormity of what they were doing. "And you're carrying all of this alone." She gave a dry laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Not alone anymore." Zack smirked. "You're welcome," he said, his voice light, though he could feel the weight of her words settling in. They were carrying the fate of an entire species on their shoulders. The sound of the Xerikian engines revving once again pulled Zack from his thoughts. He turned his attention back to the crevice's opening, peering through the narrow gap between the rocks. The Xerikians were getting closer, their bikes skimming over the sand with frightening speed. Lyra stood up, her expression set. "We don't have much time. We need to move." Zack nodded, and without another word, they slipped from their hiding place, moving silently through the sand. The storm had picked up even more now, the dust swirling around them in blinding sheets. The Xerikian bikes were almost upon them. Lyra led the way, her movements quick and purposeful. Zack followed closely, his pulse rifle raised, ready to react at a moment's notice. They had to stay ahead of the Xerikians if they had any hope of reaching Lyra's ship. Through the storm, they could barely see more than a few yards ahead, but Lyra didn't hesitate. She knew where she was going, and Zack trusted her completely. He followed her as she led them toward the rocky outcrop, the air thick with tension, the Xerikian pursuit closing in with every step. They reached the base of the ridge, their destination within sight. Lyra's ship was just beyond the next crest of rocks, and though the Xerikians were closing in fast, there was still a glimmer of hope. Zack could see the ship's silhouette against the stormy sky, its sleek design standing out in the chaos. "Almost there," Lyra murmured, pushing ahead. But the Xerikians were too close. The ridge loomed before them, the rocky outcroppings standing as the last line of defense between them and the pursuing Xerikians. The storm had thickened to a near impenetrable haze, the wind howling like a living beast, but it provided little cover. In fact, the shifting sands made their movements even more visible. Each step, every breath, a betrayal to the silent cloak they were trying to create. The Zerakian engines hummed relentlessly behind them, getting louder with every passing second. The thudding of their tires against the dry, cracked earth a constant reminder that they were not alone. Zack could hear the pounding of his own heart in his ears as he pushed forward. His pulse rifle was firmly gripped in his hand, the weapon an extension of his body now. His senses were heightened. He could feel the heat of the desert seeping into his skin, the weight of their mission hanging heavily on him. He had to keep moving. He had to get Lara to safety. Ahead, Lara's crimson form was a steady silhouette against the tumultuous dust storm, her figure cutting through the haze with purpose. She moved like someone who had spent her life running through storms, her body agile and efficient, each step bringing them closer to the edge of their salvation. She was always a few steps ahead, her violet eyes scanning their surroundings, her sharp instincts guiding them through the chaos. They had made it past the first line of rocks when the unmistakable sound of Zerakian engines broke through the air once again. Zack's breath caught in his throat as he turned to look behind them. Through the dust, he could just make out the shape of the lead Zerakian bike, the massive figure of a warrior perched atop it, his yellow eyes glowing like twin suns in the storm's haze. "We need to make it to the ship now," Lara hissed, her voice carrying through the wind. There was no time to waste. They had no choice but to push forward, to hope that their escape was still possible. The Zerakians would not let them go so easily. The sound of more bikes approaching was unmistakable. Zack's grip on his rifle tightened, and without hesitation, he swung his weapon around to face the incoming threat. The Zerakian warrior on the lead bike swung his blade, a massive, jagged sword that crackled with energy, toward them. Zack barely had time to react before the blade swept down with a thunderous roar. His instincts kicked in. With a sharp twist of his body, he ducked beneath the swing, his pulse rifle raised to fire. The blast hit the Zerakian square in the chest, sending him spiraling backward off his bike, the vehicle veering wildly to the side. But that was only the beginning. Before Zack could register the full impact, another Zerakian appeared on his right. The warrior, massive and covered in dark, thick scales, lunged at him with a roar, wielding a club-like weapon that crackled with electrical energy. Zack barely had time to raise his rifle before the club swung through the air, missing him by mere inches as he dived to the side. The warrior's weapon slammed into the ground with such force that it sent a shockwave through the sand, knocking Zack off balance. Lara moved faster than Zack could process, a blur of motion as she slammed into the Zerakian with a kick that sent him reeling backward. She wasted no time, spinning on her heel and using the momentum to bring her staff down onto his head. The Zerakian crumpled with a sickening thud, but there was no time to enjoy the victory. "We need to move," Lara shouted, pulling Zack back to his feet as the rest of the Zerakian pursuit force closed in. Zack nodded, gritting his teeth. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. They had made it this far, but the real danger wasn't in the fight. It was in the race to the ship. The Zerakians would be relentless until they had her back, and no matter how strong they were, they couldn't keep fighting forever. Together, they sprinted toward the ridge, the rocky terrain growing steeper as they climbed. Each step felt like a battle, their bodies heavy from the long journey and the exhausting chase. Zack could feel his muscles burning, his breath ragged as they neared the crest. He could see the dark outline of the ship ahead, sleek, formidable, and their only hope of escape. But the Zerakians were closer now, faster than he had anticipated, their engines roaring behind them like a storm on the horizon. Lara glanced at him, her violet eyes flashing with determination. "Jet to the ship." "I'll hold them off," she said through gritted teeth, turning toward the Zerakians. She didn't wait for his response before she reached into the folds of her outfit, pulling out a small device that extended into a shimmering silver staff. Without a second thought, she launched herself into the air, her staff whirling around her with blinding speed. Zack had no choice but to push forward. He didn't even look back as he climbed the final few steps, his mind only focused on the ship ahead. He could hear Lara's staff cutting through the air, the sounds of Zerakian growls and the clash of metal ringing in his ears. The wind was fierce now, but he didn't slow down. He had to get to the ship. They had to escape, or everything would have been for nothing. Just as Zach reached the top of the ridge, he saw the ship. Lyra's ship, a sleek craft built for speed, its metallic surface glinting under the weak sunlight that filtered through the storm. The loading ramp was already extended, waiting for them. Zach ran for it, his legs moving like they were on autopilot, his hands reaching for the edge of the ramp. But before he could make it inside, a roar echoed from behind him. He spun around just in time to see a Zerakian warrior charging toward him, a long, serrated blade raised high. The warrior's eyes locked onto him, filled with a primal rage. Zach's hand instinctively went for his sidearm, but before he could pull the trigger, the Zerakian's weapon slashed down. A blur of crimson and silver flashed past him, and before Zach could even react, Lyra was between him and the Zerakian. Her staff crackling with energy. The staff slammed into the Zerakian's chest with a resounding crack, sending him stumbling backward. But the warrior wasn't down yet. He lunged again, his massive form moving with terrifying speed. Lyra didn't hesitate. With a fierce cry, she thrust the staff forward, the end of the weapon glowing with a searing heat. The Zerakian howled as the staff made contact with his chest, the heat from the strike igniting the warrior's scales. He fell to the ground, writhing in pain, before collapsing in a heap. Zach didn't have time to thank her. He grabbed her arm, pulling her into the ship's interior as the ramp began to retract behind them. They were safe, at least for now. The engines roared to life, and the ship lurched upward, leaving the storm behind. As they broke through the atmosphere, Zach took a moment to catch his breath. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, but the reality of their escape was settling in. Lyra stood beside him, her chest heaving with exertion, but her expression unreadable. She glanced at him briefly before her eyes turned back to the stars outside the window. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice softer than before. "I didn't expect anyone to come for me, but you did." Zach looked over at her, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "I don't do well with alien barbecues," he replied. Lyra's lips curved into a small smile, but her eyes remained serious. "This is just the beginning, Captain Axton. The Krell are still out there, and my people need that crystal." Zach nodded, turning his attention back to the stars. The journey ahead was far from over, but one thing was certain. He wouldn't be alone. The hum of the engines was the only sound inside the ship as it sliced through the thin atmosphere of Xerek 12 and broke into the cold vacuum of space. Zach leaned back in his seat, eyes locked on the window as the stars stretched out before him like a million tiny lights in the dark. The storm of the desert was far behind them now, and with it, the relentless pursuit of the Zerakians. But Zach knew it wasn't over. Far from it. Lyra stood by the ship's controls, her fingers dancing across the holographic interface. Her movements were fluid, purposeful, each command given with practiced precision. Despite the chaos they had just escaped, she seemed completely at ease, as though she had been through this sort of thing 1,000 times. Zach couldn't help but admire her composure. The crystal, still safely tucked in the pocket of her outfit, was the key to everything now. The Krell, the war, the fate of her people. But it was also a target. The Zerakians, the Krell, and anyone else who wanted to see the balance of power shift would be after it. Zach had seen how valuable it was to Lyra, but he was beginning to understand that its significance went far beyond just military intelligence. He stood up, stretching his sore limbs. His muscles ached from the long hours of fighting and running, but there was a fire in him now, something that had sparked the moment he saw Lyra in danger, and it hadn't died out. He had already made it this far, and he wasn't going to stop now. He crossed the cabin toward her, taking a seat across from the control panel, his gaze fixed on her back as she worked. She hadn't said much since they had boarded the ship, and Zach respected her silence. She was still processing everything. The escape, the danger, the mission. He could see the exhaustion creeping into her features, despite her best efforts to maintain her stoic exterior. "You've been through hell," Zach said, his voice breaking the silence. Lyra didn't turn to look at him but nodded. "My people have been through worse," she said, her voice calm but tinged with a quiet sadness. "We've endured more than I thought we could, but now we have a chance. A real chance. Zack studied her for a long moment, his thoughts swirling. And what happens now? Lyra glanced at him briefly, her violet eyes flashing. There was a weight to her gaze, a history of struggles, loss, and resolve that Zack couldn't begin to comprehend. We get the crystal to Helios Prime. My people need it. The Krell are closing in, and every day that passes is another day they gain ground. We can't wait any longer. This is our only chance to turn the tide. Zack leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest. Helios Prime. That's the only place where you can decode the crystal's intel. Lyra nodded. Yes, it's a military outpost, heavily fortified. We'll have to get past a Krell blockade to even reach the system. But once we're there, we'll have a fighting chance. The weight of her words hung in the air. The Krell blockade wasn't going to be easy to breach. If the Krell were aware of their mission, it would be a suicide run. But if they didn't make it, Lyra's people would fall. The Krell would wipe them out without a second thought. Zack's thoughts turned to the path ahead. The road was uncertain, dangerous, and they had no guarantee of survival. But something in him stirred. It was the same feeling that had driven him to pull Lyra out of that fire pit, to fight through the Zarikians, to keep going when it seemed like the odds were stacked against them. We'll get you to Helios Prime, he said, his voice steady. We'll figure out a way. Lyra's eyes softened, a faint trace of something unspoken flickering in their depths. I'm glad you're with me, Captain. Zack smiled wryly. Yeah, well, I don't exactly like letting people die on my watch. She turned back to the controls, her fingers flying over the interface. We'll need a solid plan. The Krell won't be easy to deceive. They've been monitoring Helios Prime for weeks now. They know anyone who tries to approach will have to go through the blockade. And if they catch us, they'll destroy us. Zack's mind was already racing. The blockade would be tough to break through, but it wasn't impossible. He had gotten through worse. He'd faced down pirates, mercenaries, and military interceptors in deep space. The Krell were ruthless, yes, but they were also predictable. We can't go in with standard tactics, Zack muttered, more to himself than to Lyra. We'll have to think outside the box. We'll need a distraction. Something big enough to draw their attention, something that'll confuse their sensors long enough for us to slip through. Lyra turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. A distraction? You have something in mind? Zack leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. We'll use the Nomad's shadow drive. It's experimental, but if we trigger it at the right moment, we can mask our energy signature long enough to pass through without detection. It'll be risky, but if we time it right. Lyra's eyes flickered with recognition. The shadow drive, you think it'll work? I don't think we have a choice, Zack replied, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. If we don't, we'll be sitting ducks out there. Lyra studied him for a moment, her lips pressed together as though weighing his words. Then she nodded. I trust you. Zack's heart skipped a beat, and for a brief moment he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Trust. It wasn't something easily earned, especially from someone like her, but it was there. He could feel it. All right, Lyra said, her voice steady. Let's get this done. Zack felt a renewed sense of determination surge through him. This was it. Their lives, and the fate of her people, were riding on this mission. There was no turning back. Not anymore. The shadow drive would be their only chance to break through the Krell blockade, and it would take everything they had to make it work. They would need precision, timing, and a whole lot of luck. But if they succeeded, it wouldn't just be a victory for Lyra's people. It would be a victory for all those who had suffered under the Krell's iron grip. The Nomad's engines hummed softly, the stars outside swirling around them as they charted their course toward the blockade. The journey would be treacherous. The dangers they faced were unlike anything Zack had encountered before. But there was one thing he knew for sure. They were in this together. And together, they might just stand a chance. The Nomad cut through the void of space like a silent predator, its engines humming steadily as it glided through the stars. Zack sat at the controls, his fingers dancing across the dashboard, his mind far from the peaceful beauty of the starry expanse outside the cockpit window. His focus was entirely on the task ahead, the Krell blockade, a seemingly insurmountable obstacle that stood between them and Helios Prime. Lyra stood behind him, her eyes fixed on the holographic map projected in front of them. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable as she plotted their course, her hands moving with practiced efficiency over the interface. Zach could tell she was lost in her thoughts, but her presence was a constant reminder of the stakes of this mission. It wasn't just about escaping the Xerikians or surviving the blockade. It was about something far larger, the survival of her people, the Parthians, and the balance of power in the galaxy. The silence between them was thick, charged with the weight of what they were about to do. The tension in the cockpit was palpable as they prepared for the next phase of their journey. The Nomad was fast, but it wouldn't be fast enough to outrun the Krell. They had no choice but to rely on the shadow drive, a risky, experimental piece of technology that either get them through the blockade or leave them sitting ducks in the middle of space. Zach's fingers hovered over the control panel, and he glanced over at Lyra. "How's the crystal holding up?" he asked, trying to break the silence. Lyra turned slightly, her violet eyes flickering to the pendant around her neck. The fire crystal was still nestled securely there, glowing softly with an inner heat that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. "It's safe," she said, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of concern. "But the Krell won't stop until they have it. They'll stop at nothing to get their hands on it." Zach nodded, his jaw tightening. He understood that better than anyone. The Krell were merciless in their pursuit of power, and the crystal held the key to tipping the scales in the war. They needed it, and they would do anything to take it. But Zach wasn't about to let that happen. He reached for the controls, setting the course to the Helios Prime system. "All right," he muttered under his breath. "Here we go." The countdown had begun. They had no time to waste. Lyra stepped closer, her gaze locked on the map. "You have the shadow drive prepped, right? It's a one-shot deal. If we trigger it too soon or too late, we'll be caught. And if we trigger it at the wrong moment, we might not even make it through." Zach looked at her, his expression serious. "I know the risks," he said, "but it's our best shot." Lyra didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the swirling lights of the map. Zach could see the wheels turning in her mind as she processed every detail of the plan. He knew how much it weighed on her. If they failed, everything would be lost. "Lyra," Zach said, his voice quieter now, "we've got this." She met his gaze, and for a moment he saw something shift in her eyes. A flicker of gratitude, maybe even trust. "I know," she said softly. "I'm counting on you." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, there was no talk of war, no threats, no danger. Just the two of them, standing together against the storm. But the moment was fleeting, and reality came rushing back. The shadow drive, the blockade. Zach's hand moved to the activation switch. Shadow drive. Online. A low hum vibrated through the ship as the engine shifted, the glow of the control panel dimming as the ship's energy signature began to fade. Like a ghost slipping through the cracks of reality. Zach glanced at Lyra. "Once we activate this, there's no turning back. The system will be on high alert. If we trigger it too early, we'll be detected before we even get close." Lyra nodded once, her lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll have to trust the timing." Zach took a deep breath. "Here goes." With a flick of his wrist, he initiated the sequence. The Nomad's engines shifted, and the entire ship seemed to shudder as the energy signature was masked. The exterior sensors were cloaked, leaving nothing but a small anomaly in the massive expanse of space, one that the Krell would have to be extremely lucky to find. "Course locked," Lyra confirmed, her voice steady. "Shadow drive activated. We're invisible." Zach looked up at the stars. The ship surged forward, its speed increasing as they flew deeper into the Krell-controlled space. The blockade was up ahead, an impenetrable ring of warships encircling the Helios Prime system, each vessel a hulking monster in space, its weapons primed and ready. They could see the massive ships in the distance, their dark shapes looming like a wall that threatened to crush anything that dared pass. For the next several minutes, the ship's movements were careful, calculated, as they approached the edge of the blockade. Zach's pulse was pounding in his ears, and he could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. One wrong move, and they would be vaporized before they even knew what hit them. The Nomad glided through space, Moving between the ships in the blockade, the shadow drive doing its work, masking their energy signature and making them virtually undetectable. Zach kept his eyes fixed on the controls, every instinct on high alert. He knew they were close, too close. Zach muttered, gripping the controls as the ship slipped between two massive Krell vessels, their weapon systems glowing faintly as they passed. A brief moment of panic shot through him. What if they were seen? What if their ruse didn't hold? The ship trembled slightly as the final stretch of the blockade came into view, and Zach exhaled slowly, his muscles tight with tension. Then, as if on cue, the ship's sensors flickered. A warning light blared on the dashboard. "We've been detected," Zach growled. "Not good." Lyra's eyes widened, and she moved quickly to the controls. Evasive maneuvers. Now, before Zach could react, a massive burst of energy shot from one of the Krell vessels, barely missing them. The whole ship shuddered, the impact reverberating through the hull. "Shit," Zach cursed, his hands flying over the controls. "I've got to get us out of here." The Nomad lurched forward, its engines roaring to life as Zach engaged full throttle. They were in a race now, not just to escape, but to survive. Lyra's staff snapped into place, crackling with energy as she prepared for what was coming. "I'll distract them. You get us out of here." Zach's jaw clenched as he pushed the ship harder, weaving between the blockade's ships, trying to find a way through the chaos. The Krell ships were in hot pursuit now, their weapons locking onto them with deadly precision. "Go now!" Lyra shouted as she activated her staff, sending a massive burst of energy toward the nearest Krell warship. The blast was enough to throw off the targeting systems of the pursuing vessels, but it wouldn't hold them off for long. Zach cursed under his breath as the ship's systems began to overload. "I've got a way through!" Zach shouted, spinning the ship hard to the left. "Hang on!" The Nomad shot forward, the ship slicing through space at breakneck speed, barely avoiding incoming fire. Zach's heart was racing, the adrenaline coursing through him. He glanced over at Lyra. She was calm, focused, her violet eyes glowing with intensity as she monitored their trajectory. "Just a little further," she said, her voice unwavering. "We're almost there." "Ah." Zach gritted his teeth, his fingers flying over the controls as they barreled toward the final gap in the blockade. The ship jolted violently as another blast from the Krell warship rocked them, sending a tremor through the hull. The Nomad's engines screamed as Zach fought to maintain control, his hands a blur over the controls. They were close. So close. He glanced to his left, where Lyra was holding the staff in a defensive stance, her face set with unwavering determination. Her violet eyes gleamed as she monitored the incoming Krell ships, her fingers twitching over her control panel as she prepared for another strike. "How much longer?" Zach shouted over the roar of the engines. "We're almost through," she replied, her voice calm, though the intensity in her eyes told a different story. She had been fighting just as hard as he had to keep them alive, and the strain was starting to show. But she wasn't giving up. Not now. Not when they were this close. Zach gritted his teeth as he pushed the ship through a narrow gap between two massive Krell vessels, just barely avoiding the oncoming fire. The ship lurched again, another round of energy fire splashing against their shields. The Nomad groaned under the pressure, but they kept moving, weaving between the ships like a comet racing through the stars. Zach's heart was pounding, his body covered in a cold sweat as the distance to the Helios Prime system shrank. They could see it now. The distant flicker of Helios Prime in the vastness of space, its shining blue surface barely visible through the fog of the blockade. But the Krell weren't done. They were relentless. "We need to get through this final gap," Zach called out, his eyes locked on the shifting barrier of warships ahead. The gap was closing rapidly, and they had only seconds before it would be sealed shut by the Krell vessels. The only way out was straight through. Lyra's staff crackled in her hand as she sent another burst of energy at the pursuing Krell. The blast hit its target with a resounding explosion. But the Krell forces just kept coming, their massive ships charging forward without hesitation. Zach's fingers flew across the controls. He had to push the Nomad beyond its limits. There was no other choice. "Hold on," he shouted, his voice hoarse with tension. The Nomad surged forward, the final stretch between them and freedom. The engines whined as they reached full speed, and Zach pulled the ship hard to the right, narrowly avoiding an incoming blast that would have torn them apart. The next few seconds felt like an eternity as the ship threaded the needle, gliding through the final gap in the blockade. Zach's heart was in his throat, his body rigid with the strain of what they were attempting. He had never been more focused in his life, and he could feel the pulse of the ship beneath his fingertips, its engines responding to his every command. With a final burst of speed, the Nomad shot through the blockade, the gap closing behind them like the maw of some massive beast snapping shut. The Krell ships were too far behind now, their fire lost in the void of space as the Nomad raced toward Helios Prime. Zach leaned back in his seat, breathing heavily as the tension slowly drained from his body. They were through. They had made it. The ship was still intact, and they had escaped the Krell's grasp for now. He exhaled, the adrenaline still buzzing in his veins. Lyra's face softened as she turned to look at him, the fire crystal still glowing faintly at her throat. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that came after surviving the impossible. "We did it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the low hum of the engines. Zach let out a breath, feeling the weight of the moment press down on him.
"Yeah,
we did." They were not out of the woods yet, but they had just survived the most dangerous part of their journey. The rest of the road would be perilous too. There was no guarantee the Krell wouldn't find them again. But for now, they had won a hard-fought battle. They were on their way to Helios Prime, and with the crystal, they might just have the upper hand in the war to come. Zach turned his gaze to the distant blue planet of Helios Prime, the shining beacon that held the hope for a future where the Krell wouldn't rule. It was still far off, but it felt like the light at the end of a long tunnel. The beginning of something bigger, something that could change everything. Lyra moved to the co-pilot's seat, her silver hair trailing behind her like a banner. Her eyes were fixed on the glowing blue orb of Helios Prime. "We still have a long way to go," she said, her voice steady once more. "The Krell will never stop. But with this crystal, we can turn the tide. My people can fight back." Zach nodded, his eyes never leaving the planet ahead. "We'll get you there. We'll make sure this mission doesn't end in failure." Lyra's lips curled into a small, resolute smile. "Thank you, Zach. You've done more than I could have asked for." He smirked in response, his confidence returning now that they were safely through the blockade. "I told you. I don't do well with alien barbecues." Her laughter, soft and genuine, filled the cockpit. It was the first time Zach had heard it, and he couldn't help but smile along with her. The silence stretched between them, comfortable for once, as the Nomad continued its course toward the planet below. The storm of the Krell blockade was behind them. But ahead lay another challenge of the war, the fight for survival, and the fight for something greater. Something worth risking everything. And as the stars blurred outside the cockpit window, Zach felt a sense of certainty that he hadn't felt in a long time. They had survived this, and together, they might just have a chance at winning the war. For her people, for the galaxy, and for themselves.